Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Inner Voice Lessons. August, 2002. One of the first things you notice as you try to quiet the mind is the lack of quiet. All the chattering going on, all the discussions, the dialogues, the committee discussions going on up in your head, and sometimes all over your body. There seems to be never-ending chatter. Often our first thought as we start to meditate is, how can I stop the chatter? How can I just quiet all those voices so things can be perfectly quiet inside? But as you practice, you begin to realize that you just can't put a stop to things that way. It requires a more gradual process, learning to bring that conversation under control. When you start out, there are lots unskillful voices in there, and frequently the discussion is not being run according to Robert's rules of order. This voice comes barging in, that voice yells at you, this voice whispers in your ear. And all the subterfuge and techniques of a political meeting are nothing compared with what goes on in the mind, all the tricks the mind plays on itself, how the different voices try to get their way, because many of them are not just aimless voices saying random things. They have a purpose in saying their thing. There's an urging on to action in one direction or another, so they try all kinds of tricks to get their way. The mind has countless ways of getting a particular idea or a particular motion through the committee. So to begin with, when we work with the mind, we want to make that discussion more skillful. As you start meditating, try to gain some detachment from the voices, so that you're watching them from outside, instead of joining in with the conversation, taking on the voices as your own. This is one of the lessons of the teaching on not self. It's not you talking in there. There are voices in there, and you've tended to identify with them, but you can begin to disidentify with them as well. Tell yourself, I'm not necessarily responsible for things that come bursting into the mind. I don't have to act on the firing of every nerve end. I don't have to get involved. If a voice comes and urges action, just let it urge, and then it'll stop after a while. You can just keep on watching. Just the act of wanting to make that conversation more skillful, that in and of itself begins to distance you from it. Practice concentrating on the breath as a way of giving you a good firm basis on which to stand, so that you can stay outside of the discussion. But simply watching the discussion isn't going to make it go away on its own. You've also got to learn how to make it more skillful. Sometimes that means introducing new voices, like the meditating voice that says, hey, stay with the breath, make the breath comfortable, allow the breath to be comfortable. Give us some room here. This is why the Buddha didn't encourage his monks to take a vow of silence. There's a story in the Vinaya of a group of monks who began the rains retreat with a vow. Okay, we're not going to talk to each other. Each person just maintained silence throughout the rains. At the end of the retreat, they went to see the Buddha, very proud of the fact that they had succeeded in not talking to each other for the entire 3 months. But he didn't praise them. Instead he said, "You've been living like sheep, like dumb animals. This inner conversation doesn't become more skillful just by stopping your talking. To improve your inner conversation, you get a lot of help by learning good examples of outer conversation. The first thing to learn as you live together is how to talk to each other in skillful ways, which may mean talking less than you might normally do. But it also means that when something has to be said, you figure out the best way to say it. The best time, the best place, the best words to couch your comments. As you get more skillful with the use of your mouth, it forces the mind to get more skillful in the way it thinks, and you begin to notice the effects of your words. If there's something negative you have to talk about, when's the best time to bring it up? What's the most effective way of saying it? What way of saying it does the least damage to the group? As you get more skilled in using your mouth this way, you find a conversation in your mind will begin to mature as well. On top of that, there are Dhamma tapes you can listen to, Dhamma books you can read, to introduce new and better voices into the conversation. This is also why we have the chanting. Some of the phrases of the chant keep coming back into your head at odd hours of the day, and they're designed to be skillful additions to that conversation. You'll notice, as you try pulling out of your inner conversations, that some conversations are easier to pull out of than others. The ones filled with recriminations and negative thoughts, harmful thoughts. Those are the hardest to extract yourself from. But the conversations in your mind dealing with issues of true happiness, issues of being skillful, issues of reflecting on what's really important in life. Those are a lot easier to pull out of because they tend toward quietude, they tend toward concentration. So as we're training the mind, it's not just an issue of immediately stopping the thinking. It's learning how to think more skillfully, and that starts with learning how to use your mouth more skillfully. As Ajahn Lee once said, you should bow down to your mouth every day. You have a human mouth, and the human mouth has a lot of power. It's not like the mouths of dogs and cats with very limited vocabularies, just barks and meows. We can say all kinds of things. And these things can have an enormous effect on our lives. If you start paying attention to what you say in the course of the day and try to make it more skillful, you begin to see that it does have an effect on how you relate to other people, how other people relate to you. The whole context of your life is strongly affected by your speech. As you work on that fact, the act of working on your external speech connects with the issue of working on your own mind. The care you use in framing what you say, the thought and circumspection you use as you notice the right time to say it, deciding what's worth saying, what's not worth saying. These things develop mindfulness. They develop alertness, all the good qualities you need in the meditation. You learn how to gauge what's worth thinking, what's the right time to think, what's the wrong time to think. Your inner speech turns into right speech, another factor of the path. At the same time, as you've got these better voices in your head, it's a lot easier to pull out of them and watch them so that you can see. When a thought forms, how does it form? Beneficial thoughts are a lot easier to take apart in this way. Thoughts filled with self-recrimination and regret are very hard to take apart because it's so easy to get caught up in their stories. The more skillful the thinking, the easier it is to take apart. You can simply watch the thought calmly as it comes and goes because it doesn't hold any poison for the mind. As you work with the meditation, you get quicker and quicker in seeing how the thought forms, how it disbands, how it can deceive you, and how you don't have to be deceived. When we talk about making progress in the meditation, many of us think that it means very strong experiences of, say, rapture, oneness, or light. And these things are not to be sneered at. They're important. They give a sense of lubrication, a sense of refreshment to the practice. But the real progress is measured in how quickly you notice what's going on in the mind. For example, when the mind begins to slip off, the faster you catch it and can bring it back. That's a sign of progress. As you get quicker and quicker this way, you begin to see the process of thought formation in and of itself, exactly what's happening in there. When do you start participating in a thought? All too often we're aware of a thought only when it's fully formed, but how did it get formed that way? Did it just happen on its own, or was there some subliminal participation on your part? As you watch more and more carefully, you begin to find answers to these questions, for you can catch the process in action. Each thought starts out as just a little stirring, and it's hard to say whether it's a stirring in the body or a stirring in the mind. It's on the borderline between the two. Then there's the act of getting interested, paying attention to it, followed by the question, what's this thought about? Then the mind labels, oh, this is a thought about X, this is a thought about Y. And that turns it into a full-fledged thought. So the question is, can you watch the stirring that would normally lead to a thought, And then not participate in labeling it, not participate in trying to figure it out. When you can do this, you see that these stirrings come, and if you don't participate in them, they go. They come again, and if you still don't participate, they go. This way you begin to realize the extent to which thought formation is really an intentional process on your part. The desire to figure out a thought, the desire to get into the thought. What's the basis of that desire? Is it boredom? Are you tired of just being very still? Do you want some entertainment? It's dangerous, you know. Some of those thoughts, once they get formed, take over the mind and turn into nightmares. So you try to get quicker and quicker in seeing these voices as they form, where they're coming from, exactly how much you're putting into them right now, how much of this activity is just the result of past karma bubbling up in the mind. You gain more and more control over the conversations, so that when you need to talk about things to yourself, you can. When you don't need to, you can keep things quiet, and the only conversation that goes on at that time is the part of the mind in control of the concentration saying, stay here, spread the awareness here. That's the skillful conversation you want to place in charge. Once the concentration gets really solid, then you can start turning your spotlight on those voices, the control center for your concentration. But don't be in too great a hurry to do that. You want the concentration really solid before you take those voices apart. So the training of the mind is not a process of stamping out all the mental chatter in the mind. It's learning first how to make the chatter more skillful, starting from the outside, being more skillful in what you say. This is why right speech is such an important part of the practice. Because where does speech come from? The Buddha says it comes from directed thought and evaluation, which when well trained, will turn into factors in your concentration. You direct your thoughts to the breath, you evaluate the breath. That helps get you into the first jhana. But to get to the point where you can really be effective in using directed thought and evaluation with the breath, you have to be more skillful in the way you direct your thoughts and evaluate what you want to say to other people, the way you use those powers of directed thought and evaluation to create words. Both the words you address to other people and the conversation in your own mind. Then, when that inner conversation gets more skillful, you can start taking it apart in even more refined ways. Finally, when all other conversation is stilled, you can turn to question the more subtle voice of the perception in charge of your concentration. Who's talking here? Who's it labeling for? That's when things really open up in the mind. Of course, we all want to jump to that spot where you find the transcendent, but to get there it takes skill, it takes time, it takes perseverance. That's the way it is with any good thing in life. Things of lasting value take time to master. So right now we've got an hour. Do what you can within the hour. At the very least, bring some control into the ongoing committee conversation to make it easier and easier for the chatter to settle down. Once it can settle down, you can see it more clearly. That's why the Buddha said that concentration and discernment go together. You can't do just insight practice or just concentration practice. The two of them go hand in hand. And it's right here at this issue, these mental voices and how skillful you are in relating to them, that's where the real meat of the practice lies. Breathing through daily life. September 4, 2003. The mind is always working. If it were doing just 1 or 2 jobs at a time, that would be no big problem. But it's usually juggling several jobs at once. No wonder it's tired. Relationships, responsibilities, jobs, issues. Lots of things are going on in the mind all at once. Often when we start meditating, it seems like the meditation is just one more ball to keep in the air, one more thing you've got to juggle. So there's no wonder that when people leave the monastery and start trying to juggle the meditation along with everything else, they drop some of the balls. And usually it's the meditation ball that gets dropped. The alternative is to think of the meditation as a way of cutting down on the jobs of the mind. The practice as a whole is a way of cutting down on the jobs, and the meditation gives you a place to stand and do your more focused work. So instead of making the breath a job, You make it the place where the mind stands. It's good to get practice in this. This is why you need to have time away from your daily life so that you can get used to taking the breath as your foundation, lowering your center of gravity, so that you stay with the breath at all times. In Pali, the word for the object of the meditation, aramana, literally means support. It's the support for the mind. It's what the mind sits on, where the mind stands. So at first you have to put some work into getting that foundation solid. Once it's solid, though, you can stand on it, it gives you support. Then you can take on the other issues in life. One of the purposes of meditation is to put you in a position where you can see which issues are really worth taking on, and which ones are not. Being with the breath helps here in that it makes you more and more sensitive to the movements of the mind, more sensitive to what you're doing, to where there's wasted energy. At the same time, the breath gives you a place where you stand apart a bit from the activities of the world, so that you see them in a new light. Again, this is one of the reasons why you have to come out and take some time away from those activities, to get used to looking at things in that light, from the point of view of an outsider, someone who's not totally involved, not totally taken in. The Buddha recommended that his monks go off into the wilderness, places where they could get away from people, so they could have a chance to evaluate what's really worthwhile in life. You try to develop what might be called a deathbed perspective. Suppose you're lying on your deathbed, looking back on your life. What things are you going to wish you had done? What things are you going to wish you hadn't? Learn to look at your life as a whole in that way, choosing your priorities, instead of just taking on whatever little bits and pieces are thrown up at you in day-to-day activities. Otherwise, your life gets frittered away in meaningless things, trivial pursuits, and the important issues get pushed to the side. But when you step out for a while, you begin to get a sense of your life as a whole. What do you want to do with it? What's a worthwhile use of your time? Often you hear of people who are told by the doctor that they have, say, 2 or 3 months left to live, and suddenly they start dropping a lot of unimportant activities to focus on the things they find really important in life. It's good that they're getting focused in this way. The shame is that they had to wait until the last 3 months of their lives. One of the purposes of meditation is to let you step back from your life while you still have time, as far as you know, so it's not just 3 months that are lived wisely with a sense of their importance. You can live your whole life with a sense of its importance, with a sense of direction. Even if you decide that you want to stay involved in your ordinary activities, still you're doing it from a different perspective. You've got that foundation from the time you spend separately. You carry that perspective with you as a foundation developed with the breath as your support. As a result, you don't have to juggle so much, and you have a more solid place to stand when you do have to juggle the affairs of daily life. You can see which balls are worth dropping, which are not really worth trying to keep in the air, so that you can focus on what's really important. So even though the meditation is work, and that's what the word kamathana means, it's our work as meditators, the object we're focusing on. Don't think of it as one more burden to add to the mind. It's a new, more secure place for the mind to stand, a place where it can get a better sense of its priorities. That way, when you leave the monastery and go back into everyday activities, you've got a foundation to take with you. So get to know the breath. Learn to be on good terms with it. If you're not on good terms with the breath, if you seem to be fighting it all the time, it's not going to become a good foundation. This means giving it some time to show itself for what it is. You can nudge it a little bit here or there. If it seems too long, you can make it a little bit shorter. If it seems too short, make it a little bit longer. If it needs to be deeper, more shallow, heavier, lighter, whatever, you can nudge it in those directions. But then give it some time to show its results once it's been nudged. If you want it to be your friend, you have to be friends with it. You have to give it a chance to speak for itself. You have to listen. Listen carefully to what the breath energy in the body is telling you right now. What kind of energy feels good for the body? Sometimes when you're tired, you want good long in breaths to energize the body. When you're feeling tense, you might try long out breaths to let the tension dissolve away. You may find that certain parts of the body that haven't been involved in the breathing process really would like to get involved, or it would feel good for them to get involved. They, of course, don't have any opinions on the matter. But if you learn to read the sensations from your body, you can tell which parts of the body are lacking breath energy. Think of the breath going to them for the next breath, and then the next, until that part of the body feels full. Then search for any other parts of the body that could use some good breath energy. Let them get involved in the breathing, too. So even though this is work, it's work in establishing a foundation. And while you're here, it's the only thing you have to worry about. You have no other responsibilities, just be in touch with the breath, the way the breath feels. How far does the sensation of the breath go down into the body? Examine it. Is there any line in the body where you say, this part is breath and this part is not breath? Or do you have a sense that the whole body could be involved in the breathing process? Explore this so as to get to know the breath, to listen to the breath. The more carefully you listen to it, the more you learn about it. And the more you learn about it, the more it can be your friend to help you with all the various jobs the mind has to undertake. So while you're here, you don't have to listen to the Dhamma talk, just listen to your breath. What kind of breathing feels good right now? Use your imagination. Say, well, how about breathing like that? How about breathing like this? And then see what happens. This way you get to know the breath in ways you might not have otherwise. If you don't experiment, there's no knowledge gained. You don't know why things happen. But if you know that if you change the breath in this way you got those results, you change the breath in that way you got these results. That's knowledge. It comes from participating. It comes from acting. It comes from doing. At the same time, there has to be a part of the mind that just watches, just evaluates, observes. So you're learning from a combination of two factors. Your improvisation, using your ingenuity and adjusting the breath to make it feel better. And then your powers of observation to see what works and what doesn't. When I was staying with Ajahn Fuang, these were the two words he used more than any others when giving meditation instructions. To improvise, the word he used, padifan, also means ingenuity, your ability to experiment, and to be observant to see what works, what doesn't ought. This way you develop a friendship with the breath. When you're friends with the breath, you feel at home with it. It's a good place to stay. When you get used to staying here, then it really can become your foundation. When you leave the monastery and go back out to your daily life, you've got a solid place to stand. You're not constantly buffeted around by what other people are saying or doing. You've got your inner foundation, your inner refuge. As long as you're on good terms with the breath, that's the best relationship you can have. Other relationships come and go. Even our family comes and goes. As long as you're alive, the mind has to be on good terms with the body. The body should be on good terms with the mind. All our relationships in life are based on how well the body and mind relate to each other. When you're on good terms with your breath, it's easier to be on good terms with other people. When you have goodwill for the breath, it teaches you how to have goodwill for others. At the same time, when the body and mind are working together, they get their work done. They aren't fighting at cross purposes. In this way they validate each other. You don't have to go looking for outside validation, you've got your inner validation as to what feels right, what feels good, because you're really observant. As you develop your powers of observation, they get more and more reliable. So try to be sensitive to what's going on here in the body, going on in here in the breath. It may require work, it may be a job that you're not used to, but as you get more and more used to it, it becomes more and more second nature. Then you find that it really is a helper, it really is an assistant in whatever other work you've got to do. In other words, when you're driving the car, you're standing in the breath driving the car. When talking to other people, you're staying in the breath talking to other people. All your activities get brought into the breath in this way. The breath becomes the foundation that underlies them all, the solid floor on which you stand, so you can juggle your activities with skill. And with a continuous foundation like this, your life isn't chopped up into little bits. A little time for this, a little for that. It all becomes time to be with the breath, and then to work from the breath on whatever else you need to do in the course of the day. Varieties of Mindfulness. May 2003. The word sati in Pali has lots of meanings. The basic one is to keep something in mind. We're often told it means alertness or awareness, but that's not the case. Alertness and awareness come under the Pali word, sampahana. Sati means keeping something in mind, like remembering to stay with the breath, remembering the various things that help in the training of the mind. It functions a lot of ways in the practice. First off, there are the recollections. A series of themes to remember, to think about, to keep in mind when you find your meditation wandering off course in the direction of doubt, laziness, discouragement, or just general hopelessness. That chant we had just now about aging, illness, separation, and death. Those are important things to keep in mind so that you don't get complacent. But notice that the Buddha didn't stop at aging, illness, separation, and death. He went on to the principle of karma, because if all you think about is aging, illness, and death, it gets pretty discouraging. The potential for happiness lies in our actions. In other words, the Buddha didn't teach fatalism. He didn't teach that our actions are insignificant. They're important. Our happiness, our lack of happiness, depends on our actions. So that's where we focus our attention. That's what we should keep in mind. This is called Dhammanasati, keeping the Dhamma in mind. This is why the Buddha has us listen to the Dhamma, read the Dhamma, because the Dhamma contains all sorts of useful and encouraging ideas. For instance, there's the passage where the Buddha is talking to his son, and says that when you make a mistake, resolve not to make it again. If you see that your actions have gone off course, resolve not to do them again. When they've been on course, develop a sense of happiness and joy. Often we mistrust that joy. We think somehow that the critical thoughts in our mind are more real, and that the more self-congratulatory thoughts are diluted. Well, that's not the case. When you do something right, you should congratulate yourself on it as a means of encouragement, to give some juice to the path. Otherwise, it's very easy for things to get dry. If you criticize yourself about your actions all the time, you find yourself totally hemmed in. Remember that you do some things right. Focus on those to put the mind in a good mood. In Thai they use the word aram to mean both mood and object. When we're meditating, we're looking for a good aram, both a good mood and good object. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. That's another function of sati, mindfulness. If you're feeling discouraged about yourself, focus on two of the recollections, salanasati, kaganasati, thinking about the times when you did hold to your principles, when you were generous. Reflect on what you've been able to do as a means of encouragement. So there are topics of recollection to deal with just about every direction the mind can go when it falls off the path, topics of recollection to bring it back onto the path. Once you're on the path, it's important to reflect again on what sati or mindfulness means. You're keeping something in mind. Say for instance that you're keeping the breath in mind. You're tuning into that part of your experience. Our experience has many layers. You might think of it as many frequencies, like the radio waves going through the air right now. Lots of different frequencies coming right through this building from Los Angeles, San Diego, Tucson, Tijuana. If you bring a shortwave radio in here, you can tune into lots of different stations from all over the world. It's simply a matter of choosing which frequency to tune into, which layer to tune into. The same holds true when you're keeping the breath in mind. When you create a frame of reference here in the present moment, there are lots of things you can tune into. You can choose the body in and of itself. You can choose feelings, mental states, mental qualities in and of themselves. Those frequencies are on the path. Other frequencies are off the path. There is such a thing as wrong mindfulness, you know. Our meditation consists of choosing the frequencies most beneficial for the mind. So try tuning into the breath in and of itself. Be aware of the breath, making it your point of reference in relationship to everything you do while you're sitting here quietly with your eyes closed. Even when you get up and walk away, try to stay tuned into the breath. When you do work, stay with the breath. When you rest, stay with the breath. If you're going to change your frame of reference, try to be deliberate about it. In the Sutta on the frames of reference, the Buddha talks about being aware of the body in and of itself, either internally or externally. Externally means how the body relates to the world outside. In other words, you don't have to be only inside the body for it to count as right mindfulness. When you're dealing with other people, you need to have a frame of reference that includes the outside world, but doesn't grab hold of it. You can stay tuned into the body even as you're involved in dealing with other people, being sensitive to how those dealings register with the body. Then when you're sitting again with your eyes closed, you can make your frame of reference totally internal if you like. Or you can tune into the sense of space that permeates the body and extends out in all directions. So there are a lot of different things to tune into that would qualify as the body in and of itself. It's important to realize this because sometimes we fall into an ironclad notion that only certain kinds of awareness count as mindfulness. We feel that we're strapped there and can't function. There are reports of people who go for long retreats where they've been working on only one kind of mindfulness for 3 months, and when they come out they can't function. It takes them a couple of days to readjust to being in the outside world. Well, the Buddha didn't have us practice so that we couldn't function, couldn't adjust, couldn't adapt. He simply wants you to be conscious and deliberate about the way you adapt. The different levels, the different layers, the different frequencies you're tuning into. If you can shift levels mindfully, you're okay. There's an old science fiction story about a spaceship that didn't have to use fuel. It moved by changing its frame of reference. If its frame of reference was here on Earth, it would stay still on Earth. If it switched its frame of reference to the sun, it would suddenly zip out into space, away from the direction the Earth is revolving around the sun. If it switched its frame of reference to the center of the galaxy, it would shoot way out there, to other arms of the Milky Way. And the plot of the story revolved around the fact that when the ship changed its frame of reference, everybody in the ship would go unconscious for a while. Well, this is exactly how our minds work. Normally we change our frame of reference who knows how many times in the course of a day, and we blank out for a moment in between. Ajahn Lee even said that we pass out for just a brief moment and then find ourselves in another frame of reference. The purpose of the practice we're doing right now is to be able to change our frames of references without blanking out, so that we're clear about what we're doing. That's what alertness is all about. In this way we can function appropriately. When you're dealing with people, you choose the proper frame of reference that includes them, that includes that level of reality, that level of experience. When you're sitting here with your eyes closed, you can drop that frame of reference. You don't have to think about there being anyone else here in the room at all. Instead, you can focus totally on the breath in and of itself. In this way, you see how much your frames of reference really do depend on memory, another meaning of sati. What are you going to remember in order to deal skillfully with the reality before you? You can be selective. In fact, you have to be. Years back when I was a young monk in Thailand, the monastery where I was ordained had a rotating roster of monks to give the evening Dhamma talks. Out of the 14 monks on the roster, maybe 2 could give good talks. The rest I found really irritating. After a while I realized that, rather than giving in to my irritation, I could use the talk as a meditation exercise. How to be aware of the sound of the Dhamma talk without registering the meaning, in other words, deliberately forgetting the meaning of each word, and remembering only to be with the level of the sound. That's a function of sati, or mindfulness, too. Deciding what you're going to remember and what you're not going to remember, what you're going to apply to your experience and what you're not. I found that after a while I could just listen to the sound, word by word, consciously forgetting the last word to be present only with the sound of the current word. It worked fairly easily because Thai wasn't my native language, but you might want to try the skill out yourself. If you don't like the Dhamma talks you hear around here, you can just be with the sound. You don't have to listen to the meaning. Be selectively forgetful. To be consciously forgetful in that way requires an act of mindfulness, in other words, deciding which level you're going to tune into while you let everything else go for the time being. If you're going to work on concentration, you'll want to stay on one level as consistently as possible. This is why concentration practice is best done alone or in areas where you don't have to interact much with other people. But you also need to learn how to balance it with interactions with other people in a peaceful way, so you can get skilled at consciously changing your frame of reference as appropriate. This is why we live in a community. Our ability to live together is an important skill in the meditation, for it's in the changing of our frame of reference that a lot of the machinations of the mind become clear. We tend not to see them if we let our awareness blank out during the switch, but if we can learn to be conscious as we switch from one frame to the next, we begin to see the way the mind creates a reality for itself out of all the whole buzzing confusion of our senses, to use William James' term. Of all the sensory input that comes in at any one particular moment, you make a choice of what you're going to pay attention to, what memories, what frame of reference you're going to bring to that particular moment. And it's an important mental skill to be able to shift your frame of reference as necessary. So remember that that's all part of the practice. It's not the case that we're really being mindful only when we're on the level of pure sensation. We're also mindful as we shift our frame of reference to be appropriate to whatever is needed. If you go into the kitchen and you're totally on the level of pure sensation, you're going to forget how to fix the food. You have to remember enough to fix the food. When you're dealing with other people, you have to remember enough about common courtesy, remember enough about the English language in order to deal with them. But you can be selectively forgetful while you're sitting here with your eyes closed, so that you can give your full attention to the task at hand. You can take this skill and apply it to all sorts of situations. Mindfulness is not just one level of awareness, one level of experience. It means being very deliberate and clear about what you bring to whatever you're doing. What you're going to remember, what you're not going to remember, what you're going to recollect, what you're going to let go, which things are useful to recollect right now. If you wanted to, you could sit here and spend the whole hour thinking about facts that would make you totally miserable, but what does that accomplish? We're sitting here to think about things that are useful for the mind, so remember the things that are useful for the mind, that will help it develop. As for the other voices coming in and out of the mind, listen to the ones that are helpful and ignore the ones that are not. You can be selective. This way, mindfulness becomes a quality we can apply to everything we do. And instead of making us unable to function, it actually heightens our ability to function, because we understand the process that the mind goes through as it shifts its frame of reference from pure sensation to remembering language, remembering customs, whatever needs to be applied to your current situation, to your current task. So try to keep these points in mind whenever you find them useful. Beyond likes and dislikes. April 2002. One of Ajahn Mun's favorite topics for a Dhamma talk was the theme of practicing the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma, in other words, in accordance with what the Dhamma demands, not in accordance with what our likes and dislikes demand. As the Dhamma comes to the West, this is probably one of the hardest things for Westerners to appreciate. Everywhere you look, the Dhamma is being remade, recast, so that people will like it. Things that people don't like are quietly cut away. And if things that people like are missing, they're added on. And so the creature that comes out is like the old cartoon of a committee designing a bird. The bird looks pretty good to begin with, but then after the committee's done with it, it looks like an ostrich with no legs. It can't walk and it can't fly, but it sells. In this country of ours, where democracy and the marketplace are all powerful, the question of what sells determines what's Dhamma, even if it can't walk or fly. And who loses out? We lose out. The Dhamma doesn't lose out, it's always what it is. But we like to add a little here, take away a little there, and as a result we end up with nothing but things we already like and already dislike. The Buddha pointed out the 4 ways that people get led off course. 2 of them are following your likes and dislikes, the other 2 are giving in to delusion and fear. These things pull people off the path. We go wandering into the underbrush and then off to who knows where, simply because we like to follow what we like and to avoid what we dislike, even though the things we dislike are often the things we've got to really look at carefully. Why do we have such a dislike for them? And as for the things that we like, why do we like them? Exactly what do they do for us? It's easy to doubt other people. It's easy to doubt the teachings. But for some reason we find it very hard to doubt our defilements, all these convictions and preconceived notions we're unwilling to give up. Only when we're willing to put them aside and open ourselves to the possibility, okay, maybe they're wrong, can we open ourselves to the Dhamma. What this comes down to is respect. The Buddha says that the reason we're suffering is because of the craving in our minds, and yet we like to hold on to our craving. We're attached to it. Of all the things we're attached to in life, that's probably the hardest thing to let go. Our attachment to our cravings. And it's precisely here that the Buddha says that's the problem. So it's a question of how much we're willing to suffer before we say, maybe he's right, and give some respect to his teachings, to take our respect for our likes and our dislikes, our preconceived notions of what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, to put them aside for the time being, and give some respect to what the Buddha has to say. For all of us this is very hard. It's not hard just for Americans. It's hard for everybody. But given our culture these days, it seems especially hard for us, so we have to be especially careful about this issue of taking only what we like and avoiding what we dislike in the practice. What do we miss out on when we do that, given that so much of the practice goes against the grain? We like to create little worlds for ourselves. This is called the effluent of becoming that comes fermenting up in the mind, and we're really good at it. We can create all kinds of worlds. Beautiful worlds, ugly worlds, delightful worlds, horrible worlds. The movies that play in the theaters are nothing compared to the productions we can create in our minds over and over and over again. We're really good at it. We get our entertainment that way. It's a game we like to play. There are two parts of the mind. The part that likes to fool itself and the part that likes to be fooled. It's like little kids playing together. Okay, I'll be the doctor, you be the patient, or I'll be the doctor, you be the nurse, or whatever. The two parts of the mind say, okay, let's play along, and then they dive into the make-believe. This is something we do so well, day after day after day. When we come to the practice, we want it to be another fun thing to do, we want to be entertained, so when we're told to deconstruct these things it's very difficult. We're very good at putting together, at creating these worlds, but deliberately stepping out of them is hard. It's only when we begin to realize that the more we keep creating these trains of thought that we love to follow backwards and forwards, the more we create suffering for ourselves. That's when we begin to wonder. Maybe there's a way out, maybe there's something better. The Buddha has a teaching on what's called transcendent dependent co-arising. It starts with the regular chain of dependent co-arising up to suffering, and then adds, but based on suffering comes conviction. At some point you have to suffer enough to say, there must be a way out. And you're going to look for that way out. You're serious about it this time. You're willing to make whatever sacrifices are needed, even if it means sacrificing your pride, sacrificing your attachment to your craving, sacrificing all these little worlds you create for yourself to fill up the day. You want to see through that process. It's not easy, but the results are more than you can imagine, better than you can imagine. Up to now you've been living in imaginary worlds, and look at where they've gotten you. Not all that far. But if you learn to step outside them, you find that things are much wider open than you could have imagined. Even after just the first stages, when the mind settles down into states of concentration, you find that whatever presents itself as an object of discussion or elaboration of the mind, you can just say, no, 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 not interested. You can shoot it down, zap it out of your range of awareness. This yields a great sense of spaciousness. Even on just this level you begin to realize about this process we've been following for so long. Maybe the Buddha's right, maybe there is a way out. Every now and then we chant about having respect for concentration. Learn how to have respect for that quiet spot in the mind, the spot that's not creating any interesting ideas, not creating any interesting conversation. It's just a very quiet, still spot in the mind that hasn't yet settled down anywhere. Allow it to settle down on the breath, and just stay right there. Catch it if it seems to be moving off in any other direction. Bring it back. Learn how to freeze the mind at that spot. In other words, as soon as it seems to move to pick up something, just stop it, and then allow it to relax in that stopped position, and stay there. The mind may complain, well, there's nothing interesting going on here, this is pretty dumb. Okay, just let it complain, but don't listen to it. After a while, as you train yourself to grow comfortable with this quiet spot, you won't need to freeze yourself there. You find it natural simply to plug into it, for it's a good place to be. Learn how to develop this skill, and it really is an important skill, this willingness to give up on your normal inner conversations and try something really new. It requires some imagination to try it. And it requires a lot of mindfulness and a lot of alertness to stay there, because we're so good at creating little worlds right away, letting these things bubble up and flow out. The problem is they keep bubbling up and flowing out until they overwhelm you in a flood. The word asava, or outflows, effluents, fermentations. The list for these sensuality, becoming, views, and ignorance is the same as the list for the aga, or floods, when the things that bubble out are allowed to drown the mind. Learn how to keep your head above water. Learn how to keep these fermentations in check. If you're going to create something in the mind, then create this sense of stillness, this sense of centeredness, this sense of expansive awareness. Work at this, because what you're doing is taking those raw materials, taking your tendencies to create things, and turning them in the right direction. You're bringing those tendencies in line with the Dhamma that points outward. It says, look, freedom lies in this direction. You've tried lots of other things, why don't you really give this a serious try? Humility. December 16, 2003. Ajahn Suh would often mention that one of Ajahn Mun's two favorite Dhamma talk topics was the customs of the noble ones, the Ariyavamsa in Pali. One of his reasons for focusing on this teaching was something that we tend to miss when we look at the forest tradition from an American perspective. From our perspective, it's a very tight tradition. But Ajahn Mun got a lot of flack in his day for going against Thai customs, Laotian customs, following the Dhutanga practices, eating only one meal a day, eating out of his bowl, living out in the forest. People criticized him for this, saying that he was breaking with Thai custom. His response was that he wasn't interested in Thai customs or Lao customs or anybody's customs, aside from the customs of the noble ones. He said, if they're not the customs of the noble ones, then they're the customs of people with defilement. That applies to American customs, European customs, customs all over the world. Only the customs of the noble ones, he said, can keep you on track to the noble attainments. So it's good to keep those customs in mind as we're practicing. There are 4 altogether, but the one immediately relevant to what we're doing right here as we're meditating is the 4th. The first 3 have to do with the use of the requisites. You make do with whatever food, clothing, or shelter you have. If you don't get good food, clothing, or shelter, you're not upset. You're content with what you've got. If you do get good things, you don't get carried away, you don't get careless. At the same time, you don't pride yourself over the fact that you're more content with these things than other people are. You use the requisites without doing harm to yourself or to anyone else. Those are the first 3. You'd think, listening to the first 3, that the 4th would deal with medicines, but it doesn't. The 4th has to do with delighting in developing, delighting in letting go, in other words, delighting in developing good qualities in the mind, delighting in letting bad qualities go. In fact, the word bhavana, developing here, is the same word for meditation, but it means specifically developing whatever good qualities are needed in the mind. No matter how much effort needs to be invested in developing mindfulness and alertness, you're happy to put in the effort. You see the benefits that come from training the mind. The same with delighting in letting go. Many things that we really should let go of are things we hold on to dearly. In terms of the customs of the noble ones, though, you have to learn to delight in letting go, to delight in renunciation, to delight in giving those things up, for you see the benefits that come when you give them up. As long as you have these two attitudes, you're on the path. In other words, you realize that there's always room for improvement, either in terms of developing good qualities or letting go of bad ones. The question often comes, is my practice good enough? Well, are you an arahant yet? If not, it's not yet good enough. There's more to be done. That's setting a very high standard. Many people don't like living with high standards, but remember what happens when you set a target for archery. You never hit higher than you aim. If you wish for true happiness, aim high, and then try to live with high standards. This means, on the one hand, not being complacent. On the other hand, it means not browbeating yourself over the fact that you haven't reached the goal, not getting discouraged in ways that will actually get in the way of your reaching the goal. You need to have the right attitude toward making progress along the path, focusing on what needs to be done, rather than on your image of what or where you are. What this means is that you don't get down on yourself, but you realize that there's always a better way to do things. You learn how to focus cheerfully on where to improve. This is why so much of the practice lies in focusing on the present moment, because this is where the improvements can be made. It also involves learning where to focus in the present moment, realizing that a lot of the big abstract issues in the mind come down to events, very specific patterns of events. This is a lot of what discernment is. Seeing the processes of the mind as they give rise to greed, anger, and delusion, or to mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. Even though these things have abstract names, they're specific events. Choices are made each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out. Look for the specific choice, look for the specific movement of intention that heads either in a skillful or an unskillful direction. Try to notice the trigger points that set off anger, set off delusion, set off greed or fear. Also look for the trigger points that help develop mindfulness, that remind you of what you should be doing. In other words, learn to break down the big job facing you into specific events in the mind, specific choices in the mind. See where you can make a difference with the specifics right here, right now. This is a constant learning process. If you want to gain a sense of confidence in the practice, gain it from the fact that you're always willing to learn, instead of talking about how good you already are, which is a very hollow sense of confidence, because it always has to be shored up as it's crumbling away. If you're willing to learn all the time, it can give you a solid basis for confidence on the path. I noticed that Ajahn Suwat, even though he'd gone very far on the path, was always working on a little something here and there. Sometimes he'd take a volume of the canon down to his hut, read about things, see if he could expand his knowledge of some of the details of the Dhamma. A year or two before he left America, he asked me to come up with the English translations that we chant here in the evening. Up to that point we'd been chanting in Pali and Thai during the morning and evening chants. One day he said, "It's time we had some English translations around here." So I worked them up, and he memorized them. It took him quite a while, because English was of course not his native language, and he had never formally studied it, but he memorized the chant in English. He was always working at something. What this attitude requires is humility. Realizing that there's room for improvement, and that there are lessons to be learned all around. I've been reading a book on tracking animals, the physical and mental skills needed to go out into the wilderness and notice things that you wouldn't ordinarily notice. The author says that one of the qualities needed in tracking is empathy. Empathy for the animals you're trying to follow, realizing that you have something to learn from them. Even though they're common animals, they've got something to teach. You empathize with them, and you have humility. As he says, those are two qualities sorely lacking in our society. We reward people who come on with a really strong sense of self-confidence, a sense of self-esteem, a strong sense of pride. And yet those attitudes get in the way of learning a lot of subtle, important things. So remember, We're here to learn not only from the obvious places, such as Dhamma books and Dhamma talks, but also from all the specific things around us. They're teaching us lessons in terms of cause and effect. Last week, someone came with the question of how to welcome difficult events in life. Well, look on them with humility. There's a lesson to be learned. When you're open to learning that lesson, you gain in knowledge. That way there's hope. When you close off your willingness to learn, there's no hope for you on the path. So even with little things like sitting here with the breath, you watch one breath and you can ask yourself, how can this breath be more comfortable than the one before it? Look and see what your sense of the body has to tell you that way. It might be a part of the body you've been ignoring all along. Give it some good breath energy. Then, when the next breath comes in, here's another chance to learn from the breath. And the lesson might be, don't mess with me. Just sit and watch. But whatever the lesson, try to watch carefully. Try to empathize with each breath. And try not to be mechanical in the way you breathe, thinking that if you can somehow get through 1,000 breaths you're going to gain awakening. It's best to take each breath one at a time, because that's all you've got. One breath at a time. We're not just trying to get through the breathing to the end of the hour. We want to open up and appreciate each breath for what it has to teach us. It teaches us about the processes of breathing, it teaches us about where our blind spots have been. So, approach the breath with an attitude of humility and empathy. Delight in the opportunity it gives you each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out to abandon unskillful mental qualities and develop skillful ones. More mindfulness, more alertness, more consistency in the way you make an effort in the meditation. Several skills are involved here. In addition to the attitude of empathy with the breath and humility in learning the Dhamma, there's also an ability to break down the larger issues in this recalcitrant mind of ours into smaller ones. We have to learn how to break down all of its unskillful qualities into manageable bits so that we can really observe how they take control. That way we can see how specific skillful qualities can be strengthened to fend them off. You can read the books and learn all about the names for these skillful and unskillful qualities, but to get results, you really have to be alert and sensitive to each individual movement of the mind. This is where the humility lies, because a lot of time the lessons we're going to learn are the lessons that come from little things. A few days ago I was in a Dhamma discussion in Laguna Beach, and we got into the first precept, dealing with ants and termites. After a while, someone made a sarcastic comment. Gee, what a profound Dhamma discussion we're having here, talking about ants and termites. Well, that comment misses the whole point. The way we treat ants and termites is very important in our practice. It's in how we deal with the little things that spreads out and influences how we deal with the larger issues. If you learn to show respect for ants and termites, it means you can learn how to show respect for other things as well, little things that you wouldn't anticipate. There's that classic story about the Buddha during his quest for awakening. He had attained all the states the teachers of his time recommended, but he still wasn't satisfied. He had tried years of self-torture, but hadn't gotten anywhere. He was at an impasse. Then he came across the simile of the lute that was strung too tight, the lute that was strung too loose. One version of the story says that a woman happened to pass by in the forest singing a song on this topic. He learned something from her that he hadn't learned from all the highly respected teachers of those times. That's what's meant by an attitude of humility. A willingness to learn from the little things, no matter where they show themselves. Humility requires being attentive, watchful, not assuming that you already know, that you're already good, realizing that there's always room for improvement. You have to delight in that fact, to delight in actually making the improvements, letting go of the unskillful qualities in the mind, developing the skillful ones. This is how we follow the customs of the noble ones. And that way we open ourselves to the opportunity of experiencing the attainments that the noble ones have attained. This is the end of this episode. We will seeing you on our next episode. In accordance with the Buddha's guidance, we stress the significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, We've converted this extensive 1,000-page book into an easily accessible audio format. It's now your turn to contribute to this noble cause. By subscribing, liking, and sharing this content, you actively participate in the spread of these teachings for the benefit of others. Together, we uphold the tradition of sharing knowledge and mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. Join us in this endeavor, and collectively, we can bring about a profound impact in the lives of many.